Dobry wieczór, moi drodzy, kochani jedyni. Witam Was bardzo ciepło na kolejnym webinarium Poland, czyli Światowego Instytutu Action Learning w Polsce. Mam na imię Tomek, prowadzę Poland, prowadzę też szkołę Action Learning i poprowadzę dla Was też to webinarium. Słuchajcie, to webinarium jest dość wyjątkowe. Wiecie pewnie, co zaraz się wydarzy. Już za chwilę połączymy się z Mike'em Marquardtem. Ale zaraz dowiecie się dokładnie, kim Mike jest i zaraz go zobaczycie. Namawiam Was do tego, żeby zalogować się do YouTube. Wtedy możecie wziąć udział w czacie. Macie też przywilej subskrybowania tego kanału, żeby być na bieżąco z kolejnymi nagraniami. Witam stałych bywalców, witam też świeżynki. Jeśli jesteście pierwszy raz, to bardzo się cieszę. Słuchajcie, zaczynamy. Teraz będzie krótka czołóweczka, a już za chwilę zobaczycie mnie wspólnie z naszym gościem. Jedziemy. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me switch to English and just say that we have an amazing guest with us today, a consultant to international business, a professor emeritus of George Washington University in the United States, an author of, I guess, around 30 books on professional, personal, and organizational development, a co-founder and former president of the World Institute for Action Learning. Did I miss anything, Mike?
No, that's very good. Thank you.
Dr. Mike Marquardt is with us today. How are you doing today, Mike?
Okay, I'm doing fine. It's a pleasure to be with the folks in Poland. I remember our conference, I guess 3 or 4 years ago,
Yeah.
and it was beautiful, a great conference, and I enjoyed Warsaw and the surrounding area. So I'm pleased to be back in Poland via the Skype methodology.
Mike, imagine that you are at a conference, like a typical business improvement conference or human resource development conference, and somebody approaches you and they say, "Hey, Dr. Marquardt, I heard about action learning, but I'm not quite sure what it's all about." What would you tell them?
Well, I simply described action learning as where you have a group of people who have been asked to solve a complex, urgent problem for the organization. And they use a methodology called action learning, which they are not only working to solve the problem, but they are learning as they work together. So they improve their leadership skills, their team skills, their problem-solving skills. And so that enables them to solve the problem more quickly, more creatively, and gives them ability to do many things they could not do before in their future life.
Okay, let me dive into the details of today's presentation and show all of you who are watching us the slides that Mike prepared for us today. We're talking about the science behind the magic of action learning. This is the title of today's presentation. I will be changing the slides because we're using software through which only I can change the slides. Mike, would you like me to begin and show the first slide with the 6 components?
Yes, please.
Okay, here it is.
Okay, thank you. So now I'll give you a little bit more detailed description of what action learning is. And action learning at its most powerful level has 6 components. Most action learning around the world just focuses on the action, the 3 items on the right. So an action learning is built around a problem. The more urgent the problem is, the more action the group is going to create. The more complex the problem is, the more the group has to learn to understand it and develop appropriate strategies. So the essence of all action learning is built around an urgent, complex problem. Secondly, you have a group of people who have been tasked to solve this problem. Ideally, you have people with different perspectives, because if you have a marketing problem and you only have marketing people work at it, you don't get as creative or diverse ideas as if you bring together people from non-marketing backgrounds. You bring in people from other parts of the organization, maybe from outside the organization. But it's 4 to 8 people. We all know that to solve a problem and to grow as a team, if you have more than 8 people, the group becomes dysfunctional. And most of us have been in large groups and we see how dysfunctional they are. On the other hand, you want at least 4 people because you need to have creativity, energy, and capability to carry out the ideas and strategies. And the third action part of action learning is that you have the action that the group takes. So it's action at every action learning session. There are actions. There's decisions made and strategies determined and steps that are going to be carried out between the action learning sessions. Now, typically, depending on the complexity of the problem and the urgency of the problem, would determine how often an action learning group meets. Some action learning groups have a very urgent problem and they have to solve it that afternoon. It might be a safety issue, or they have to make a selection of some between some options. So an action learning group may meet, just one time for 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, they have developed the great strategy that will solve the problem and keep it solved. Most action learning problems, however, are a little bit more complex, and so a typical action learning group may meet 3 or 4 times for 2 or 3 hours over 3 or 4 weeks. But generally, the problem is urgent enough that usually the group completes its work within 2 months. And it's very important that the group be a group that's present for all the sessions. So if there's 5 in the group, it's very important that all 5 are present. So that's the one part of action learning, the action part. Then there's the learning part, which makes action learning different. Because having a problem and having a group of people work on that problem and developing strategies, that's what problem-solving groups do all the time for hundreds of years. But what makes action learning unique is we have 3 learning components, which are not present in the typical problem-solving group. The first is that the way the action learning group works is very different than other problem-solving groups. Typically, a problem-solving group, people come into the group with their ideas, their strategies, and they spend much of their energy trying to convince other members of the group that this is what the problem is, or here's the best strategy. Whereas in action learning, we do it just the opposite. The language of action learning, the communication, is questions. We even have a ground rule within action learning that statements can be made only in response to questions. And the reason we use questions in action learning is, first, it helps the group be much more creative. They're going to come up with better ideas and strategies. 2, it keeps the group focused. They have to listen carefully to each other because no one knows when a question may be asked of someone else. And 3rd, most importantly, questions enable the group to learn. While they are working on the problem, the questions work on their subconscious to help them become more creative, develop their skills, and so forth. So that's the first learning component of action learning. The second learning component is you have a person in the group whose responsibility is to help the group learn. Other problem-solving groups may have a facilitator or some moderator, but action learning has a coach who has a very particular role. The coach is there to help the group learn, to help them become a great team, because the smarter they are as a team, the better they work together as a team, the better actions they'll come up with. So this coach is not involved in working on the problem, but working on the learning, improving the capability of the group. And then the final component is that in action learning, when you join an action learning group, you are told before you join the group or as soon as you arrive that we are here for 2 purposes. One is we're here to solve this problem. Second, we're here to learn. We're here to learn how to become better leaders. We're here to learn how to work better in teams. We're here to learn how various ideas that we develop can be applied to other parts of the organization. Because in action learning, we realize that solving the problem may be worth $1 million to the organization. But if we can develop a high-powered team, if we can develop 5 leaders that will be working in that organization for years, if we can apply the strategies that we use to solve this problem to other problems in the organization, that may be worth $1 billion to the organization. That's the power of action learning. The benefit may be 100 times more what it would be in a typical problem-solving group. So how is action learning used? You can go to the next slide,
Okay.
where we talk about the benefits of action
Mike,
learning.
actually, before we go on to the next slide,
Sure.
you just talked about the coach. And one of the questions that appeared in the forums when people signed up for this webinar was this: what competences must the coach have? If you were to name the main competences of a good action learning coach, what would they be?
Well, I think first to recognize that anyone could be a great coach, just like anyone can be a great leader. A coach is a great leader, but the skills of a great leader, therefore the skills of a great coach, first, the coach is there to help others succeed. He or she is not there to say, I know this, I'm boastful, I can handle the problem, here's how you folks should act. The coach is there to help the team become a success. And therefore, he only asks questions that will help the team learn and work better together. So the emphasis in a sense of humility and caring about others and supporting others, which would be, in many is considered the most important leadership skill of top leaders, the ability to help the people around them become better at what they do, be successful, be better problem solvers, better leaders, and so forth. I think the second important skill of a leader is that he's able to see the entire environment, the system, and ask the types of questions that will generate the learning and transform the group. So they have the ability to see the system and ask questions about it. They have to be committed to learning. They have to recognize that solving this problem is important, but helping the group learn so they can solve the problem and future problems is even more important. So they have to recognize that learning is very, very important. Obviously, they have to be patient. They have to be able to see and do many things at the same time. I think they have to be aware of the impact of when they ask the question of their body behavior, the impact of their questions. So to be very self-aware of what they can do and the impact of what they do. So those would be some, I think, of the important characteristics of a coach.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. And I'm switching the slides to the next one right now.
Okay, so the next slide talks about why action learning is growing around the world. 20 years ago, only a few organizations used action learning, partly because it was still developing as a methodology, and partly because there were not the awareness of what it is and how it can provide benefits. But action learning has 5 benefits, and they occur kind of simultaneously and together. You cannot develop them separately. So the focus of action learning is solving the problem. The group is there to solve the problem. But in order to solve a problem, you have to be able to work in teams, you have to learn team skills. You have to develop leadership, leadership. To solve the problem, you have to apply the ideas and strategies into the organization. So you have to know about organizations. And you have to know how the community, the customers will respond to the strategies that emerge. So action learning develops all of these benefits continuously and simultaneously throughout the action learning sessions. So first, in my experience with action learning, and I've worked with a number of different methodologies over the years to solve problems, develop leaders, and I have found that the very best methodology for solving problems is action learning. And as a matter of fact, the more complex and difficult a problem is, the only methodology that solves a difficult, complex problem in a creative, sustainable way is action learning. Only a creative group that fully understands the problem can come up with a strategy that is remarkable and sustainable. But action learning is the best way to develop leaders, because to develop a leader, you only can develop leadership skills through practice. You can't develop leadership skills just from hearing theories or lectures. So action learning has that unique ability that while you are working with a group of people solving a problem, every single leadership skill can be practiced, improved, and developed. So that makes action learning by far the best way to develop leadership skills. You and I have worked, and all of us have worked in teams probably our whole life. And 99% of all teams are dysfunctional. They're frustrating. They get less done with more effort than some individuals can. But anyone who has experienced an action learning group, within 30 minutes, they say to each other, this is the best team I've ever been a part of. Action learning creates great teams, and the teams get smarter and better. If they meet a second and a third time, they become more and more powerful as a team. And of course, action learning is used to change organizations, to change the culture of the organization, change the competency of the organization, change their understanding of the system. So the best way to build learning organizations is through creating action learning groups throughout the organization. And then the final benefit is it impacts the community, because anytime you change an organization, the organization's operating in a community of customers or neighbors or citizens. And action learning enables these organizations to be much more effective and competent when they operate in the communities that they serve. Now, if we go to the next slide. Sure. So I've told you that, gee, action learning is really powerful. It's wonderful. It does great things. But I did not have this confidence in action learning when I first discovered it or my first years in working with action learning. But once I was able to put together the model that you've seen of the 6 components of action learning, once those 6 components were all in place, I discovered that action learning worked every time I did it, as long as I had all 6 components in place. And the system was in place, it worked every time. And I said to myself, well, and it worked in every culture, every type of organization, any type of group of people. So I said to myself, that cannot be by luck or circumstance. The only way something works effectively and systematically and continuously, it has to be based on science. And so over the past 20 years, I've been examining, well, what are the sciences behind this very simple process? 6 components that interact with each other. As long as you have those 6 components, it always works. And the reason it works because it's built on such strong theory. And I note here Kurt Lewin, who's considered probably the top organizational theorist and problem-solving theorist in the history, John Lewin, he says there's nothing as practical and valuable and powerful as theory. So what I'm going to be presenting to you today is what are some of the theories and sciences that make this very simple process, methodology called action learning, so powerful and so regularly successful. So what I did, and as over the years, there's probably been 100 different theories that I could see how they work in action learning. What I'm going to share with you this evening is some of the key theories from social sciences and from physical sciences. So if that slide is up there now, Tom. So in the social sciences, I'm going to look at 4 of the social sciences. First are education and learning theories. So how different educational learning theories are incorporated in those 6 elements of action learning. So I'll always be referring back to those 6 components of action learning. How organizational leadership theories incorporate each of those 6 components. How psychology, different schools of psychology, and sociology, I'm including economics, political, and organizational theories. So those are the 4 social science theories that I'll be looking at to see how action learning, the 6 components of action learning, incorporate all of these many different theories and sciences. But what makes action learning so unique, unlike most other methodologies, it uses the physical sciences as well as the social sciences. And you see in the very model that you saw, it was a model of the atom, which is quantum physics. And so action learning uses quantum physics rather than Newtonian physics. It uses atomic theory. Second, the biology. Action learning is aware of how the brain works, how the physical body works, how your synapses in your brain, the cortex, etc. So it incorporates those elements. Third, there's various mathematical including algebra and trigonometry and all those mathematical dynamics of action learning. And the final one I'll use today is the engineering. There's a number of different engineering theories that kind of provide a foundation, a buttress to action learning. So the 6 components of action learning incorporates a number of different engineering theories. So that's what I'll be doing over the next 30 minutes, showing how the different components of action learning incorporate and integrate the various theories. So the first, we'll look at the schools of learning. And so those of you who are into learning and development theory, there are 5 schools of learning. And they've occurred kind of historically. 150 years ago, almost all learning was behavioral. You were conditioned. Whether it's military training or how to to learn a language or type or whatever the case may be. But behavioral learning was the primary form of learning 200 years ago, the only form. And then, maybe 100 years ago, you started getting into cognitive learning, where you look at how the brain works, how the brain makes decisions, how the brain is creative. And so you looked at how the cognitive part of learning. And then maybe about 75 years ago, we had the third school of learning, which is the humanist, in which we're concerned with saying that learning in the first school, it's the behavior is kind of the body. You look at how the body learns skills and mechanisms and so forth. The second was kind of looking at how the mind. The third school of learning is kind of looking at the heart and saying that to learn, it's human beings who are learning with emotions, and they have to be respected and cared for and so forth, and they've achieved their highest possible destination. So the the humanist school of learning, Carl Rogers and others, appeared in the 1940s, 1950s, about 60, 70 years ago. And then about 50 years ago, you had the social school of learning. You had people like Freire and others that say, well, we learn in groups. We learn on the job. We learn in the family. So learning is a social activity. And you have to be, and so who do you learn with and around and within the workplace? And so that became, and so the social, and all these schools had a number of theories and principles. And the final one, which maybe began about 30 years ago, the constructivists saying, no, what you learn is after you have an experience, you reconstruct what happened, and you learn from experience. You learn from reflection. You learn, and you can gear or have your brain say, I want to learn in a certain way, and so you construct before or after your experiences. So it became the constructivist school of learning. Now, typically an organizational methodology, a training methodology, uses one or at most two schools of learning. Action learning is so unique and wonderful, it uses all five theories, all five schools. So, for example, I give some examples if you go back to the 6 components of action learning. So, in action learning, we use a lot of behavioralism. You have a ground rule, 2 ground rules saying that statements can be made only in response to questions. It's very observable, very measurable, and people are focused, encouraged, guided to, okay, I can only make statements in response to a question. I can ask anybody a question at any point. So that conditions you. It creates the optimal conditions for that to occur. So there's ground rules. There's a script that guides the coach so that the coach be sure you get everybody engaged in every action learning. You get the quiet people and the extroverts. You get action at a certain point. You say, okay, we got 30 minutes by which time we have to then determine what actions we're going to take between this session. So the coach is doing a number of things which creates behavior. Also, when we get an urgent problem, we behave. The natural thing is to, if you get an urgent problem, your brain, your body goes to it in a behavioral way. Now, cognitively, in action learning, we use the cognitive school. We constantly encourage questions. Questions are the essence of the cognitive school, because questions get you to help you make decisions. You have to make decisions when you get a question. If I ask you a question, you have to decide how you're going to respond, or give you a choice, whatever it may be. But also problem solving. All problem solving uses the cognitive school. To be creative, you look at the cognitive school is concerned about creativity and making better decisions. The humanist in action learning, it's a very positive, warm environment. The coach is there to be sure that everybody is well protected. There is no storming or fighting, because the coach has this question that ground rule. If anybody is dysfunctional in some way, the coach will intervene. Everyone in the group has the possibility to be a leader at any point, to be the most creative. A junior member of the group who asks a great question may become the most influential member of the group. So everyone in the group is respected, protected, and can achieve power and optimization in a sense because they asked the question that helped others, or they answered the question that helped the group come up with the great strategy. The fourth school is the social school. So we recognize that learning is most powerful in teams. You don't learn as much as individuals. You can't learn in a great classroom or on TV or on your video or whatever. The best learning is in teams, particularly a team that's learning together, getting smarter together, helping each other. So in action learning, we have great social interactions. We have opportunities to praise each other, to help each other become a better leader, to ask each other how we could solve this problem. So it becomes a warm group, and you learn much better in teams than anywhere else. And the fifth school, constructivists, we recognize in action learning the problem presented is rarely the real problem. You have to reframe it. You have to now look at the problem from different perspectives. You have to reconstruct reality. Find out what the root problem is. And you have to look at potential strategies that may reconstruct the organization. And the leadership skills. When we're trying to help you develop your leadership skills. Leaders, if you can have new skills, you start seeing the world differently and behaving in the world differently. So those are the schools of learning.
Mike, I have a question.
Yeah, okay.
Because you spoke about questions a lot, about the use of questions during action learning. And one of the questions that appeared from our participants who signed up for the webinar, where one person is asking this question: does working in action learning setting and using questions really translate into a larger number of questions in everyday work in teams?
My short response is yes, that once you've been in an action learning group and you see how questions make the group work better together, you enjoy questions, you see the power of questions, you see how questions help develop strategies, develop relationships, develop learning. What happens is that these questions are so wonderful in this action learning group. So when you go back to your organization, you start using questions. You can say, well, the questions are the greatest thing out there. There's nothing more powerful than a question. It's wonderful. You start using questions more with your spouse or your children, because anytime you make a statement, you may have lost an opportunity to lead or help or learn. So the experience I had, anyone who's been a part of an action learning group, they just start realizing that questions are so wonderful. They do have many benefits, and they naturally start asking more questions in the workplace or in their family setting or whatever the case may be. Okay, so then we'll go to the schools of psychology.
Okay.
And there's many schools, but I've listed on this slide, there are 6 schools.
Yeah, sorry, theories of... Actually, the next slide was leadership, organization, management, but we can do psychology if...
Oh, okay. I got my slides backward here. Let me see. No, okay, so the next slide you have is the... it should be the psychology. What you have is
fine.
Which slide?
That's fine. Let's do psychology.
Okay, so there's theories of psychology. Okay, so I listed 6 schools of psychology. Many of you are familiar with them. The first one was the behavioralists, again, because learning theory a lot of the learning theories come from psychology. That's the essence of learning comes more from psychology than any other discipline. And you have the humanists, but you have some new wrinkles in a sense. You have the Gestalt school, you have systems psychological school, and I put the classical and psychoanalytical. So first, behavioralism, psychology, they feel that the way to develop people, to help people learn, you create an optimal learning situation, environment. You have a quiet place, you maybe have a supportive environment, but behaviorism trying to say that if we control your environment, we can create an environment that will make it easier for you, more enjoyable, more likely for you to learn, to develop, to change your behavior. So they create the conditions that cause your behavior to change. Sometimes it's very, enjoyable and supportive. Sometimes they can create conditions that make you a negative person. So in action learning, we do a number of things that kind of make the conditions good for learning. The ground rule that statements can be made only in response to question. That's the most powerful, positive, measurable norm any group anywhere in the world. And so it's set in place, it's observable and measurable, and the group is conditioned to say, okay, I've got to either ask questions or answer questions. And so it changes the whole way you think and operate because of the condition of behaviors that's occurred. But also there is, I list here, the coach, every question the coach asks, because of the way the behaviorism is occurring and theory of behavior, every coach, the questions asked of the team goes into their subconscious. I've created the way the coach works in action learning, and the questions used by a coach go deeply into the subconscious. And you're not even aware of the depth to which those questions go. But you will note that if we have session number 2, when you see me, your subconscious remembers all the questions I asked at the previous session. And those questions are causing you, consciously or subconsciously, to act in a certain way. And generally in action learning, it's a very positive, supportive, creative way. But action learning does use the behavioral school. The humanist school, well, for example, if I say, what are we doing well as a group? And the group says, well, we're asking each other questions, or we're being respectful. The next time you see me, you say, gee, my subconscious, I asked that question, what are we doing? But I could say, what would make us more effective, or how did this impact that? So any question, or I'm observing that such and such a behavior has occurred where someone has, been not listening to someone else. And what's the impact of that? Well, when they see me next time, their subconscious remembers every intervention I made, every question I asked, and that continues to influence how they behave. They're not even aware of it, but it's always, again, it's a positive way. You can use behaviorism for negative purposes, but action learning always use it for a positive perspective. So the second school is the humanist, and so in action learning, we want everybody to feel comfortable. We want it to be an environment that you like each other, you respect each other. And so questions, when you ask someone a question for their ideas or their perspective, you like them, they like you. It creates an environment and it shows respect. I can say I like you, I respect you, but the best way to show that I care for you and I respect you is to ask a question of you. That's the deepest and best way. So throughout the action learning process, people are getting respect. They're given the opportunity to help each other. There's a very positive, warm environment. If anything becomes dysfunctional, the coach intervenes to help the group understand what's happened so they can improve the environment. So if people are at their best, they might be a manipulative person or a domineering person outside of the action learning group, but inside the action learning group, they're a much different person. They're a much more positive, supportive person because the behavioralism that's been set up in school number 1 is impacting the humanism that's occurring from school number 2. Now, the third school I put here is the Gestalt. It came out of Germany about 100 years ago. And this is that the Gestalt is, you have an experience, you see the entire thing. All of a sudden you go into a new environment and you have a Gestalt experience. And you can't explain it all, you can't connect it all, but your brain starts interpreting it and so forth. A Gestalt would be that, for example, I showed you something and there were 6 circles, but one circle was not quite complete. You wouldn't see it. You just automatically would complete the circle. There's a number of things with Gestalt, but that's the idea of getting the whole experience. So in action learning, we always encourage, because in order to understand the problem, the root problem, you have to understand the entire system. You You have to see the big picture. When you develop strategies, you have to say, how is this strategy going to impact the people who implement the strategy? How will it impact other parts of the organization? How will this impact the community? So you have to have this gestalt. But it's done very quickly through a great question can give the entire group a gestalt experience. The fourth school is the systems, where the systems school where you start looking at systems, and this is atomic energy, and where everything's connected. Talk about the example, to put a pebble in the ocean, it starts impacting everything around it. And so systems that where if you change one thing, you change everything around it. So you don't have to have multiple strategies. You have to have one great strategy, because that great strategy has the ability to affect the entire system. The fifth school I put here is the classical, the Maslow and Freud and others, the classical psychology, where you look at the subconscious and your childhood and whatever, and that influences how you think and relate to people and so forth. So in action learning, we recognize the importance of the subconscious. And I mentioned earlier how the coach kind of intervenes, provides ways to affect your subconscious. So you're able, like for developing skills, when you develop a skill, whether it's being a great golfer or swimmer or father or, language translator, the skill is so inherent and deep in your subconscious, you do it without thinking. The best example, a golfer, there's so many important things to become a great golfer, to hit the golf ball. But it's all in the subconscious. The only conscious thing the golfer does is to stare at the ball and hit the ball. He doesn't try to remember all the things his arms are doing and what's going to happen after he hits the ball and all that. He has to, and so the subconscious, and that's true of every skill. You're a swimmer, a great leader, his consciousness is maybe right with the person in front of him, but his subconscious is integrating all the learning and experiences he's had in his life. And so using psychology well, classical psychology, reinforces and introduces great skills in a short, impactful way. Okay, so my next slide then are the leadership organizational theories. If we can do that. Sure. Okay, so I've listed 5 theories. Most of you, I think, are familiar with all of them. The one that's been very influential the last 20 years is servant leadership. That a great leader serves the people he supervises or she supervises and tries to make them all successful, to serve them, find how can I help my subordinates and colleagues become more successful. That's what the servant leader had a number of characteristics of being humble and supportive and caring, etc. So in action learning, the coach is kind of the perfect servant leader. She's there to help the group become a success. And oftentimes, as a theory, you don't realize, gee, we could have done it without the servant leader. But in reality, we know it doesn't happen. The original servant leader is when the servant leader left, the organization falls apart. The same thing in action learning. You can say, well, we don't need a coach. We'll just we'd learn a little bit about how to work in teams. But without the servant leader, it just doesn't happen. You need that person who's only focused on helping other people succeed rather than on himself succeeding. Also, the other thing with servant leadership, everybody's encouraged to be a servant leader because in action learning, you spend your energy not in trying to convince others. I'm the one who has the right answers, or I'm trying to convince others. In action learning, you spend your energy trying to encourage other people to express their perspective. So you ask other people, well, what do you think we should do here? Or what's your experience that might help us here? So every member of the group is a servant leader when they ask the question of others to help them solve the problem. So that dynamic. The second, systems management, is where you look at systems theories and you try to get as many different perspectives as you can. So in action learning, we seek diversity in the group. When you put together this group of people to work on a problem, you don't have just experts on the problem. You want people with different perspectives, potential client, someone from another department, someone from another part of the organization, because that is the only way to see the entire system. And you have questions, therefore, from different perspectives that encourage and allow you to see the entire system. The third is conflict management. You know, a key leadership skill, or part of daily leadership, is that there's conflict, and how do you manage conflict rather than avoid it? Because conflict, there's a lot of energy and potential in that conflict, but oftentimes it becomes so destructive that the organization doesn't thrive very well, or the group of people under that manager. So in conflict management, we realize the way to manage conflict, you establish some norms before the group gets together. So action learning has this norm. Statements can be made only in response to question. The coach has the power to intervene when there's an opportunity to learn. And so there's no storming in action learning groups, because and conflict is ideas, not personalities. We encourage conflict in different ideas, but when you have conflict of personalities, that prevents the group from working together. They aren't creative. They don't put their energy in the right place. So action learning with conflict management, realize the way to solve conflict is first create some norms that people agree to or understand. And these norms are positive, non-conflict causing norms. And when you don't follow the norm, you find ways to make that norm work in a new situation. The fourth leadership theory I put here is empowerment. That the great leaders empower the people around them. They give power. It's not just motivating, because motivating is you're trying to get people to do what you want them to do. You motivate them to do what you want. Empowerment, you give them power to do what they believe to be the right thing, the best thing. It's a little bit more of a risk, but organizations have to empower their workers, their other leaders. Otherwise, it cannot, compete. It cannot utilize the abilities of other people. So in action learning, we use empowerment. Everyone in the group is empowered. Anyone has the power to ask a question of anyone else in the group, and the power emerges from the quality of their question and their impact. The power is based upon what you are able to do to help the group solve its problem or work more effectively together. And the final leadership theory I have is appreciative inquiry, where you focus on the positive. In action learning, we never focus on the negative. We ask questions about what we can do better. How can we improve? How can we get there? But we never spend time saying what went wrong, or what aren't we doing well, and what leadership skills are we not practicing, because that doesn't work. It causes entropy. It takes energy away from the group. So action learning always uses appreciative inquiry, always the positive, always future, always goal-oriented to where we can go.
Mike, another question from one of the participants of this webinar, who is asking this. Can you show some real-life examples where action learning really changed employees' behavior and had a significant impact on business?
Yeah, well, there are many. Let's take the second part first. There are hundreds of examples of where action learning has had a significant impact on an organization. And if you go into the World Institute for Action Learning website, they have a number of case studies and examples of how organizations were benefited by action learning. An example I like to use is one with Sony Music. It's a global company, and about 10 years ago, they were facing this challenge that there was less income coming from selling records. People were stopped buying records. They would go to iTunes and music and Spotify, whatever. So the revenue coming from an artist, a singer, was declining. And so Sony Music put together an action learning group that would look at how can we increase the earnings of our artists, or at least keep them from continuing to decline. And so they came up, the action learning group met for 2 days over maybe a 4-hour period, and they came up with what they call the super contract strategy. And so when they hired a new artist or rehired a current artist, they had a super contract, which says that we not only manage your records, we manage your tours, We manage we get you on television and inside movies. We get you your products. We'll help you market because most singers, they get much more money from their tours and people buying their shirts or their periphery or whatever it may be. And so they developed a contract. So you became an artist signing up with Sony. You committed yourself for everything. Now the benefit was, instead of having your school buddy be your manager, you had a professional manager. Instead of trying to sell things in a local store, you had a global company. You got your music onto TV shows or into movies and so forth. So it proved to be it attracted many new artists to Sony, and those that were there, made a lot more money. So it helped the Sony music. Now, in terms of how behavior changes, as I mentioned earlier, when you are in an action learning group, you start realizing the power of questions. And so I've seen many times where, oftentimes, as when we, at the end of a session, an action learning session, we ask the group, how are you going to apply what you've learned here into your organization? What I hear most frequently is that when I have a problem from now on, instead of just having a couple of my buddies or some expert, I'm going to bring people from other parts of the organization, because I realized that we had people from different organizations or different disciplines, and they were much more creative, and it was a better way to say. So in the past, I kept the problems myself, or I found a couple people in my field. Now, when I got a problem, I'm going to bring 3 or 4 people from different parts of the organization. And so you see that happen very frequently. It's a very easy, simple, but very valuable thing to do. But also how they lead. They move. I can be a better leader by asking questions. I can be a better leader by being a servant. I can be a better leader. I can make my team meetings more effective instead of just running a staff meeting this way. I will do it that way. So I'll be a different kind of father. I mean, many times I say, well, I'm going to ask my teenager son some questions rather than just, so you hear every time, and that's a great question from one of your listeners, is that every time in action learning, one of the final questions that the coach asks the group before it ends that particular session, what have we learned today, done today, that you can apply to your life and to your organization? And so at every session, each person writes down at least 1, if not 2. Here are 2 things that I'm going to do differently tomorrow, based upon what I learned at this action learning session day, and how I live my life or how I lead in my organization.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I was smiling
so
because I hear those pieces of feedback too, when you mentioned that it's so valuable not to think about the problem on your own, but rather invite people with different perspectives. So a lot of Polish people think that American culture and Polish culture are so different, and yet they are not, at least in this case.
Okay, so I'll go to the next slide, which is a sociology.
All right.
So we look at, there are a number of theories, and I didn't want to go into great depth on each of these, but basically what political theories are all concerned about: how power is distributed, who gets the power, how you maintain, lose power, justice, democracy, the relationship between the state and the individual. That's what political theory is all about. So in action learning, we practice good political theory. We believe that power is not finite. It's not a fixed amount. It can grow and share, but it moves around. And power is, whoever asks the best question will have the most power, most influence. And it's not who has the most hierarchy or who has the most experience. It's who has the best question. But in the action learning, everyone's equal, because everyone has the ability to help the group solve the problem. Everyone may be involved in some aspect of implementing it. So there's a lot of the power is shared. There is a meritocracy in a sense, and the power that, so the better my questions are, the better I listen, the better I commit myself to helping others and taking actions that have been recommended, the more, more influence and impact I have in the group. There's a sharing success. Our strategy, we all built it. It might have been an engineer asked the question that became a marketing strategy. But the engineer shares in the glory as well as the marketing people. And the norms use, instead of having a constitution, you have the norm. The Constitution is saying, here's how the government should operate, how people operate. In action learning, because it's just the group, all you need is the two norms: statements in response to questions and the power of the coach to help the group learn. Now, economic theories are built around supply and demand, scarcity, cost, benefits, incentives. So, anytime you're in a group, there's a limited, finite availability of resources and infinite need for resources. Again, like the political. But in action learning, you create more and more wealth. You create more and more opportunities. It grows so that everybody, it's not a scarcity of time. Part of it, we control the time. We only have no more than 8 people. If there was 24 people in a group, you'd have a scarcity in terms of economic. People just don't have airtime or ability to influence. But 8 or less people, the scarcity issue is gone because everyone has the ability to participate and get the time they need to be successful. So you have rewards. You get rewarded every time you learn something. You reward yourself because you can apply that and do it more effectively, be loved by your clients or colleagues because you get rewarded for your improved skills, your improved ability, your improved questions. The culture in action learning, you have a culture that is a very supportive, positive culture, a learning culture, a continuously improving culture, a respectful culture. So those are all based upon the key economic theories are. And then in groups and organizations, we know that there's a lot of group theories out there and group dynamics. And action learning uses the best of all group theory, recognizing that diversity is most critical for creativity. The more complex and difficult a problem is, the less valuable is expertise, and the more valuable is diversity. But we look at how groups form and storm and norm and so forth. In action learning, we go right to the norming stage before they're even formed. And so you have all the benefits of how groups develop. Each group member knows very clearly what's expected of them. It's not like, geez, I don't know what I'm here for or why I'm here or what I'm supposed to do. Very quickly, you're given your role. Your job, your role is to ask questions and to answer questions that are directed to you or to the group. That's your role. There's no other role. You do that, all the other things fall in place. So it becomes very simple, but incorporates the very complexity of group dynamics into a very simple process that works every time. Okay, so those are the social sciences that I wanted to mention. Now I'd like to go into the 4 physical sciences. The first being physics. We have that slide there. So basically in the world, there are two worlds of physics. One is the Newtonian physics, and the other is quantum physics, atomic physics, fusion physics, whatever it may be. And so Newton developed physics in the 1600s, about 400 years ago. And that was the dominating understanding of how the world operates, the physical world operates, for 300 years. Unfortunately, the organizational setting, we still use Newtonian physics, even though it was debunked among physicists. Physicists don't use Newtonian physics much anymore, except to explain a few things. They moved to quantum physics.
Mike, but how come? How come? What
way.
Do you mean that we use Newtonian physics in organizations?
Well, I'll give the examples of Newtonian physics.
All right.
You have in a slide here, Newtonian physics believes that what you see is reality. So this paper here is a solid object. And so you operate upon what you see physically. Quantum physics say, no, this is not a solid object. It's primarily space. It's the speed of the electrons that give you the illusion that it's a solid. So we tend, in Newtonian physics, we tend to operate on what we see rather than what we don't see. In Newtonian physics, we use input. The more input, the more output, like dynamite. The more dynamite we have, the greater the explosion. Atomic or quantum physics said, no, it's the speed of the electrons that determine the power. So all I need is a small container with fast electrons, and I can blow up an entire city. So power is not based upon input, it's based upon strategic connecting of electrons. In action learning, it's the questions are the electrons, the speed of the questions that create the explosion. So, but most of us operate, the more input, the more output, right? That's what leaders do. The third thing we tend to do, we tend to be linear. This will cause this will cause that. If I do this, so-and-so act, and he will act, it's linear. Whereas in Newtonian quantum physics, no, it's not linear. It's the systems, it's chaos. This may impact multiple things around it. It's not linear, it's not clearly, you kind of get a range of potential. Linear say, okay, if I do this, this will happen. Quantum physics said, no, if I do this, multiple things will happen. But within this range. So like weather people look at the weather, they used to say, well, it's going to be 100%, they're going to rain. They say, no, here's the range in which things can occur. So Newtonian physics, we tend to look, as I said, we look at the observed, and we look at quantity. So that's what most leaders still think and operate in the Newtonian world. We need to operate in the quantum world, because that's what the reality is. That's the physical, the true universe. And so on the left column, on that you see that we look at electrons and atomic power and systems and so forth. So action learning uses the left side of the quantum versus Newtonian. And so throughout action learning, you see these elements. Questions are quantum. Statements are Newtonian. Chaos, action learning, we recognize there's chaos is okay. You don't know the answer yet. You don't know what the real problem is yet. You don't know who's going to ask a question of when. And you don't know when the great strategy is going to emerge. But you know it will emerge if you allow the creativity and energy in the group. You have the systems, you link and leverage. Quantum, you don't need input. You need the right action at the right time that will cause multiple great reactions and responses and impact. You look at the big picture. You look at the holistic. You look at the entire world, in a sense, but the entire community. So solving this problem, implementing this strategy, we have to be aware that this strategy will have impact on the organization, on clients and citizens and whatever. So you have to kind of have this holistic perspective. And your goals have to be quite, holistic and broad and so forth. So like, for example, I use an example, my daughter teaches the first grade, and typically using Newtonian physics, if there's a problem, you try to work with that student, say, how can I get that student to be a better behaved student? Quantum physics, how can I make the classroom a great learning environment for everybody? It's a different way of thinking and operating. So that's the physics. The next one I have is the biology and neuroscience. So this is the last 20 or 30 years, we've become much more aware of how the brain operates. We're aware of the prefrontal cortex, rational part of the brain. And we've done it because we have the tools, the technology that allows us to put wires, and you can see what part of the brain reacts to this kind of environment, et cetera. And so we know that the brain responds most clearly to threat and pain. Going biologically, we were going back to the time we lived in caves, and you stepped out of a cave and you're fearful of a lion attacking you. Our brain has to preserve itself, protective, and tries to avoid pain. You have to handle those things before you can do other things. So the number of theories of brain that I put out here that, when you ask questions, your brain, the synapse in your brain's open. When you make statements, they tend to close. We tend to be, our brain works more effectively when we're in an area of calmness. We're comfortable. So there's a number of things that make the brain work better, help our nervous system work better, help us be more creative and enjoyable and comfortable. And so action learning recognize these things. Again, the importance of questions. They know that the brain unless you open those synapses, you're not going to be able to make connections and come up with creative strategies. But also, the group has to feel comfortable and relaxed. It's not going to be creative. It's not going to work well together. It's not going to come up with wonderful strategies if there's a concern that they're going to suffer pain, or there's going to be someone's going to get hurt, or there's too much chaos around them. So the coach kind of provides through the norms and his or her questions, creates a nice environment. The people start liking each other because they're praising each other about their leadership skills that emerge. There's always feedback in a positive way. Everyone can participate. If you're not, everyone can ask questions. And if you're not asking questions, either the coach or someone say, no, Tom, do you have a question you'd like to ask? Or Tom, do you have a suggestion here? So, but it's done, and no one's forced to participate, but everybody's encouraged, and you're given the opportunity, and you want to participate. So, action learning uses the biology, and then the next science I have is mathematics.
Okay.
Addition.
And before we move on, a quick question from one of the participants. Since we're meeting online, even right now, somebody asked, what is the difference that you see between action learning face-to-face and in an online setting? Yeah.
Well, one of my concerns was when the pandemic began that, would I be able to do action learning? I've been doing it for 20 years and loved it. And we have hundreds of action learning coaches around the world with the World Institute. And my experience and discovery was that action learning works equally well, virtually as it does face-to-face. There's really no difference because with Zoom or Skype or whatever, we can see everybody. The important thing for an action learning face-to-face, that everybody can see each other, particularly the coach needs to see everybody's faces. And I can see everybody's faces more clearly on Zoom than I have to look around the table. The norms are the same. Action learning is a global system. It works the same way, the same norms, the same 6 components anywhere in the world with any type of organization. So that's true whether it's a virtual world or face-to-face world. So my experience at action learning, and I've done many coaching sessions, and you and my colleagues have done the same, that we have found no difference. That the ability, matter of fact, we can do more because you can put groups together on virtual that you could not do face-to-face. So if you have someone from another country or another city, they couldn't normally be part of the action learning team. But now you can put anyone you want on the action learning team. Get your best 5 or 6 people from anywhere in the world. They can be there. So you can have better teams. You can record it, so it's much easier to be, reflecting on what's done or seeing what's happening. It's easier to set up time for it. So I think my experience, it works even better with virtual action learning, online learning than it did face-to-face.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, good. So let's go to mathematics.
All right.
Now, one thing in action learning is we say that the learning is very important. Learning will help you solve this problem you're working on quicker and better, but also the learning can be used for other future problems. And I use the mathematical example. Typically, a problem-solving group can only add. So it goes 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6. And so if the problem-solving group is facing is the number 1,000, it's a fairly simple problem involving a simple strategy. The non-action learning group could perhaps solve it. But most of the problems we face today are more complex. So instead of being the number 1,000, it's 2 billion. So if you're a typical problem-solving group, and you can only do 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 8, how long would a problem-solving group that does not learn, but only can add, solve the problem 2 billion? The answer is 30 years. It would take 30 years if you counted every second. 2 plus 2 is 4. Every second you add another 2. It would take you 30 years to get to 2 billion. Now, if it moves from being a problem-solving group that only uses the 3 action items, it adds the 3 learning components. So now it can multiply by 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. How long would it take a multiplying group, an action learning group, to reach the number 2 billion? 3 minutes. You go from 30 years to 3 minutes if you multiply by 2 by adding 2. And you go from 2 billion to 4 billion in 1 second. It will take you another 30 years to go from 2 billion to 4 billion if you can only add. That's the power of learning in an action learning group, is that an action learning group can accomplish in a much shorter time what a non-action learning group does. And working with Microsoft, I worked with one of their senior leaders. He said, we got done in 3 hours what normally took us 3 months. We'd meet and try, and eventually 3 months later we'd come up with the actions. And action learning we did in 3 hours. So that's the aspect of multiplication. Now, also in action learning, we use algebra, where you have to find the unknowns. You have to fill in the gaps. So you use a lot of algebra. Trigonometry, where you have to project what works here, how can it work there? How can we apply this strategy, this learning to other places? So all these elements of action learning, we talk about the projection, the multiple applications. That gives the power to action learning, because as I mentioned, solving this problem may be worth $1 million, but if we can use the same strategy, and the better the strategy is, the more likely it can be applied in multiple situations. So that strategy took us 2 hours to develop, but now we can use that same strategy in multiple other situations with minor tailoring of it. Then my next one is the engineering and social sciences. I think that's our final one, where you have different engineering theories. I put general systems theories, open and closed systems. So some systems you look at just what's occurring internally, whereas open system is the entire environment, entire world, the universe. You have chaos systems versus planned systems. I put cybernetics, like a thermostat. You have systems which control things. But all engineering is geared to define, develop, operate, maintain, and ultimately replace the current system. That's what engineering does. It tries to do things well, but continually improve it through better planning and so forth. So action learning, we always use questions to help understand the entire system. Important that when you look at a problem, you have to understand not the problem only by itself in isolation. You have to understand the entire context, the system. Most problem solving, you try to isolate and look at just the problem. Action learning goes the opposite way. So you have to understand the context, the environment, in order to understand the problem. So that's good systems thing. We have fresh questions from multiple perspectives, which encourages chaos, encourages you to go outside the closed system. We have the interaction between the group and the members, between statements and questions. The interaction between the current state and the desired state, internal versus external causality. So all these dynamics that occur within the 6 components of action learning, they incorporate these engineering theories. So my final slide then is saying, just now that you kind of see the power of action learning, particularly the theories that make it so powerful, you can see why, in my experience and many others, there is no better way to solve problems more creatively and more quickly than action learning. No better way to develop leaders, great leaders, continuously improving leaders, more leaders than through action learning. Best way to build a team is through action learning. The best way to change an organization, transform it, is through action learning. And the best way that organization can influence and change the environment, the community around them, is through action learning. So hopefully this has given you a quick overview of why action learning is so powerful and always successful if it incorporates the 6 components that I identified at the beginning of our presentation. So I'm open to other questions that you have collected, Tom, or new ones that have emerged.
Yeah, let me know. This is to all of you who are watching. this webinar. Let me know if you have any questions. You have to be logged into YouTube, so use the chat. You can type in Polish or English, whichever you prefer. So don't worry about your language abilities. Just use Polish if English is not comfortable for you. You have a minute or two to type in your questions in the chat box. And let me just mention that if you are interested in learning action learning, you're considering becoming an action learning coach, training action learning coaches in your organization, or using action learning in your organization in any way. Now, there is School of Action Learning in Poland happening in October, and we're collecting the group right now as we speak. The September edition is actually happening sort of right now because just today I finished with the group the first module, Foundations. So the whole program is basically 2 modules, Foundations, which is like the basics of action learning, and Calc, which stands for Certified Action Learning Coach, which is the more advanced part, which also prepares you for the certification in the World Institute for Action Learning. There's no additional payment. You do have to do some additional things, but it's a chance to get certified with a global organization. Online, it's 6 days, and you also get access to online platform in which you have more presentations and tools and everything. So if you're considering that, go to whilepoland.org. There is a part of this website is devoted to the School of Action Learning, whilepoland.org, or you can reply to me via email using that email that you got from me with the notification about this webinar. And so you can schedule a call with me, like a call in which I help to decide whether action learning is for you or not. And I'm happy to answer all your questions about action learning and the School of Action Learning. So let me check. Yeah, Mike, did you want to say something?
No, I'm
sorry.
waiting for questions.
Okay. I thought you wanted to say something. Let me check.
I just want to encourage people to sign up to become an action learning coach. You have one of the great coaches in the world, and Tom. So, and we're very pleased with how action learning has grown, and have wonderful coaches that I think are having a significant impact in making Poland a greater country.
Thanks so much, Mike. Yeah, I also, you mentioned in the beginning, the conference that took place. Actually, it was 5 years ago, 2016.
5 years.
Yeah, that's amazing. So it was wonderful to have you here during that time. Let me see if there are any questions. I can't see any questions in the chat.
Okay.
Maybe one quick question from our participants who wrote the questions in the sign-up form. One of the questions that appeared was, what were some unexpected results in your action learning experience practice? You sort of talked about it before, that you were surprised with how action learning worked. Did anything special happen ever in your sessions? Were you ever shocked by what happened in the session or the results of your session or program?
Well, one thing is, when you are involved in quantum physics, you're involved in divergent questions from a variety of perspectives. I am always surprised, and the group is always surprised with the quality of ideas, strategies, and actions that emerge. Most of the time, when you work on a problem, you make kind of a minimal or solving the problem. It may not be fully solved. It may not be a sustainable strategy. But I'm always surprised by how, after a very short period of time, the people become more creative. Questions are better. Team works together. They enjoy each other. And so, every time when I've been a coach, I'm surprised by the strategies that they were not those that I expected, or anyone in the group really expected, but they were strategies that were much more comprehensive and systematic and sustainable. They oftentimes came from a source that was not expected. Working with one organization, they're working on something, on automotive, where you had to have a decal in the automobile and so forth. But in the group was a librarian. And the strategy that they developed was built on how libraries distribute books and loan books out. Mm-hmm. But so that's why it's important diversity. But it was a surprise that, you figured it'd be someone who was an expert in marketing would be the one that would come up with a strategy for marketing. And oftentimes it's someone from another discipline or another part of the organization that has an idea or strategy that, hey, we do this all the time in our department. Why don't you consider that here? And so that's oftentimes a surprise. So as a coach, there's two things. I always expect that I'm going to change the individual in the group, that they'll become great leaders and they'll be changed for the rest of their life. That's an expectation I have. The second expectation, I expect that the group will come up with a breakthrough strategy that will surprise everyone. And so, and as we know, what you expect as a coach, what you expect from as teachers, what they expect from their students, tends to be what occurs. So as a coach, I expect two great things: that everyone in the group will be changed for the rest of their life, and that the group will come up with a breakthrough strategy. And so because I expect that, that's what happens using the sciences, the psychology theories, all the psychological theories, all those sciences I talked about, says that what you expect and you create the conditions for those to occur is what happens.
Yeah, I remember one time I did a webinar here, and it's available to all of you if you want to watch it. You go to YouTube, to this channel, with Agnieszka from FedEx, who is a sales manager in FedEx, and she is a graduate of the Calc program as well, the School of Action Learning. And I remember her saying that every time she runs a session in her organization, she is uncertain, anxious about whether the group really will come up with a breakthrough solution. And every time they do, and every time she is relieved and surprised that it really works.
That's the magic.
Yeah.
The magic of action learning. It's magical, but the magic always works because the sciences make the magic work.
Mike, thank you so much for being with us in this webinar and for these incredible insights linking action learning with science.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I wish everybody in Poland the greatest of success. Hopefully we'll see some of you at the global conference, and hopefully some of you will become action learning coaches. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Mike, and thanks to all of you who are watching this webinar. Thanks for being with us live. All the best to you. Again, if you're interested in the School of Action Learning, go to wildpoland.org or contact me personally. Have a great night. Take some rest, and I will see you soon in one of the YouTube videos or one of our webinars. I can see some thanks coming up in the chat box. Thanks again, and I'm turning off the YouTube stream now. Mike, you and I can stay connected,
yes,
but
okay,
I will see all of you very soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.